Julian Thorne adjusted his $30,000 Patek Philippe watch, the platinum cool against his skin, as he surveyed the meeting room on the 87th floor of his corporate tower in the heart of Manhattan. At 48, he had built a tech empire from scratch, a feat that had made him one of the wealthiest men in America, with a personal fortune north of $5 billion. It had also made him one of the most arrogant. His office was an obscene monument to his boundless ego. Walls of black marble imported from Carrara, modern art pieces that cost more than entire suburban mansions, and a 180-degree panoramic view that served as a constant reminder that he was, quite literally, above the mortals who scurried like insignificant ants on the streets below. But what Julian enjoyed most wasn't his astronomical wealth. It was the cruel power this wealth gave him to humiliate and crush those he considered inferior. It was his favorite sport, a game he played with the precision of a master chess player. "Mr. Thorne," the trembling voice of his secretary crackled through the golden intercom, interrupting his thoughts of superiority. "Mrs. Ramirez and her daughter have arrived for the cleaning." "Send them in," he replied, a cruel smile spreading slowly across his tanned face. "I'm going to have a little fun today." For the past week, Julian had been meticulously planning his favorite game of public humiliation. He had received, as part of a family inheritance, an ancient document written in multiple languages that the best translators in the city had declared impossible to fully decipher. It was a mysterious text, with characters that seemed to blend Mandarin, Arabic, Sanskrit, and other languages that even university specialists couldn't identify. But Julian had turned this into his most cruel form of entertainment. At that moment, the glass door opened silently. Elena Ramirez, 42, entered in her impeccable navy blue uniform, pushing the cleaning cart that had been her faithful companion for the last 6 years working in this building. Behind her, with hesitant steps and a worn but clean school backpack, came her daughter, Sophia. Sophia Ramirez was 12 years old and the perfect antithesis to the world of obscene luxury that surrounded her. Her black shoes, though polished with care, had seen better days. Her public school uniform was patched but spotless, and the public library books sticking out of her backpack had clearly been well loved. Her eyes, large and curious, contrasted dramatically with the submissive, fearful gaze her mother had developed after years of being treated as invisible. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne," Elena murmured, her head bowed, exactly as she had learned he expected. "I didn't know you had a meeting. My daughter is with me today because I have no one to leave her with. We'll come back later if you prefer." No. Julian stopped her with a laugh that sounded like the bark of a predator. "Stay. This is going to be absolutely amusing." He stood up from behind his black marble desk, his eyes gleaming with the cruelty of someone who had found new prey to torture. He circled them like a shark, enjoying the obvious terror in Elena's eyes and the confusion in young Sophia's. "Elena," he commanded, his voice dripping with venomous condescension, "tell your daughter what her mother does here every day." "Sophia already knows, sir. I clean the offices," Elena replied in a low voice, her hands gripping the handle of the cart until her knuckles turned white. "Exactly. She cleans," Julian applauded sarcastically, his voice laced with contempt. "And tell me, what is your level of education, Elena?" Elena felt the heat of humiliation rise to her cheeks. "Sir, I finished high school." "High school? Just high school?" Julian burst into a cruel laugh that echoed throughout the office. "And here you have your little daughter, who has probably inherited the same mediocre genes." Sophia felt something strange stir inside her chest. For years, she had seen how other children in her class lived in large houses, had new clothes, and were picked up by their parents in luxury cars. She had accepted that her family was different, that they had less, but she had never seen anyone humiliate her mother in such a direct and cruel way. In fact, Julian had an idea that seemed absolutely hilarious to him. "Sophia, come here. I want to show you something." Sophia looked at her mother, who nodded nervously, and she approached the desk with small but determined steps. Despite her youth, there was something in her eyes that Julian had never seen in Elena's, a spark of defiance that had not been completely crushed by poverty and circumstance. "Look at this document," Julian said, placing the ancient papers in front of her as if they were a dirty rag. "The 5 smartest translators in the city can't read this. They are university doctors, professors with international titles, specialists in languages who have studied for decades. Sophia looked at the papers with genuine curiosity. Her eyes moved over the strange characters, over the words in languages that seemed to dance between different writing systems. "Do you know what that means?" Julian asked with a mocking smile that stretched across his entire face. It was a rhetorical question, a cruel joke designed to demonstrate the obvious inferiority of this poor girl in the face of educated academics. To his surprise, Sophia didn't look away immediately. Instead, she studied the document with an intensity that was disconcerting in someone so young. "No, sir," she finally replied in a low voice. "Of course not," Julian roared with laughter, slamming the table with both hands. "A 12-year-old girl from a cleaner's family? When doctors with 30 years of experience can't either." He turned to Elena, his voice becoming even more venomous. "Do you understand the irony, Elena? You clean the toilets of men who are infinitely smarter than you, and your daughter will end up doing the exact same thing because intelligence is inherited." Elena gritted her teeth, trying to hold back the tears of humiliation that threatened to spill. For 6 years, she had endured comments like these. She had developed an emotional armor to protect herself from the cruelty of men like Julian. But seeing her daughter humiliated in this way was different. It was a pain that cut deeper than any personal insult. Sophia watched the whole scene with an expression that was gradually changing. The initial confusion was being replaced by something more powerful: indignation. Not for herself, but for her mother, who worked 14 hours a day to support her 3 children, who never complained, who always found a way to put food on the table and school supplies in their backpacks. "But enough of these games," Julian said, returning to his seat, clearly enjoying every second of his spectacle of cruelty. "Elena, you can start cleaning. And Sophia, you sit there in silence while the important adults work." "Excuse me, sir." Sophia's clear, firm voice cut through the air like a sharp knife. Julian turned, surprised that the girl dared to interrupt him. His expression was a mixture of amusement and irritation. "What do you want, girl? Are you going to defend your mommy?" Sophia walked slowly across the office, her steps echoing on the marble with a determination that surprised everyone in the room. When she stood before Julian, she looked directly into the eyes of the adult who was trying to intimidate her. "Sir," she said with a calmness that contrasted dramatically with her age, "you said that the best translators in the city can't read this document." Julian blinked, confused by the confidence in this child's voice, who should have been trembling with fear. "That's right. So what? And can you read it?" The question hit Julian like an unexpected slap. Throughout his life, he had used his wealth and position to intimidate others, but he had never claimed to have specific academic knowledge. His fortune came from smart investments and ruthless business decisions, not from higher education. That's beside the point," Julian stammered, feeling for the first time in years that he was losing control of a conversation. "I'm not a translator, so you can't read it either," Sophia declared with a simple but devastating logic. "Does that make you less intelligent than the doctors who also can't?" Elena gasped. In 12 years of life, she had never seen her daughter challenge an adult in this way, and she had certainly never seen anyone, child or adult, put Julian Thorne in such an uncomfortable position with a simple question. Julian felt his face turn red, a mixture of anger and something he hadn't experienced in decades: shame. This 12-year-old girl had just exposed the fundamental hypocrisy in his logic with the brutal clarity of innocence. "That's completely different," he roared, his voice rising in volume to compensate for the weakness of his argument. "I am a successful businessman. I'm worth almost $3 billion. But does that make you more intelligent?" Sophia asked with the same unshakable calm. "My teacher says that intelligence isn't measured by the money you have, but by what you know and how you treat others." The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Julian found himself completely disarmed by the simple but impeccable logic of a 12-year-old girl who had just destroyed his central argument with the precision of a surgeon. Elena looked at her daughter with a mixture of terror and pride. Terror because she knew that Julian Thorne had the power to destroy their lives with a single phone call. Pride because, for the first time, she was seeing her daughter stand up for herself, and by extension, for the dignity of her family. "Besides," Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "you said I couldn't read the document because I'm a cleaner's daughter, but you never asked me what languages I speak." Julian felt a strange shiver run down his spine. There was something in the way Sophia had pronounced those last words that gave him a bad feeling. "What languages do you speak?" he asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sophia looked him directly in the eye, with a confidence that seemed impossible in someone so young. I speak native Portuguese, advanced English, fluent Spanish, intermediate French, basic Italian, conversational German, basic Mandarin, conversational Arabic, and beginner Russian. The list flowed from her lips like a powerful sequence, each language pronounced with a precision that made Julian's jaw drop slowly. That's 9 languages, Sophia added, with a small but triumphant smile. How many do you speak? The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Elena was paralyzed, not only by the shock of hearing her daughter list languages she herself didn't know she knew, but by the realization that the power dynamic in the room had just completely shifted. Julian opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. For 48 years he had used his wealth as a shield and a sword, intimidating others with his financial success. He had never found himself in a situation where a 12-year-old girl had intellectually outmaneuvered him in public. That's how, he stammered, all his arrogance evaporating. Would you like me to try to read your document? Sophia asked with a politeness that somehow made the offer even more devastating. Maybe I can help where the doctors couldn't. And at that moment, Julian Thorne realized that he had made the most serious mistake of his life. He had completely underestimated the wrong person, and he was about to discover that some humiliations can't be bought your way out of. The little Sofia Ramirez was about to change his world forever. The silence that followed Sophia's question was so dense it seemed to have a physical weight. Julian Thorne, the titan of industry, the man who moved markets with a single phone call, found himself completely paralyzed by a 12-year-old girl who had just dismantled his entire worldview with the brutal simplicity of the truth. His hands trembled slightly as he processed what he had just heard. 9 languages. A girl who was supposed to be grateful for the crumbs of public education had just declared that she spoke 9 languages, more than he could ever hope to learn in his lifetime, even with all his billions. That's impossible, Julian finally stammered, his voice sounding strangely weak in the room he had specifically designed to intimidate. Where did you learn all that? Sophia looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of patience and determination, as if she were explaining something obvious to an adult who hadn't been paying attention. At the Municipal Public Library, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice calm and clear. They have free language programs every day after school. There are also videos on the internet, free apps, and books that anyone can borrow if they have the curiosity to learn. Each word was like a soft but devastating blow. Julian realized that while he had been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on art that no one saw, on exclusive restaurants where he flaunted his wealth, and on watches that cost more than Elena's annual salary, this girl had been quietly building a wealth of knowledge that he could never buy. Elena looked at her daughter with a mixture of astonishment and terror. She had known Sophia was smart, that she always brought home good grades, that she spent hours at the library, but she had never imagined the true extent of what her daughter had been learning in silence. The programs are run by immigrants who live in the city, Sophia continued with the same unshakable calm. Mrs. Wang teaches me Mandarin on Tuesdays. Ahmed helps me with Arabic on Thursdays. Maria teaches me Italian on Saturdays. They are people who, like my mother, have simple jobs, but know incredible things. Julian felt a wave of nausea. This girl had just described a learning network that he never knew existed, a community of people he would have automatically dismissed as inferior, but who apparently possessed knowledge that rivaled that of university professors. But that doesn't mean you can read a complex academic document, Julian said, desperately clinging to any shred of superiority he could maintain. Speaking basic languages is not the same as understanding specialized ancient texts. You're right, Sophia agreed, surprising him. That's why I also study in the classical languages section of the main university library on weekends. The librarians let me in because I always return the books on time and never make any noise. Julian's jaw dropped completely. The university library? On Saturday mornings, it's almost empty. I've been reading about comparative linguistics, ancient writing systems, and the evolution of languages for the last 2 years. It's fascinating how languages connect to each other through history. Julian sank into his chair as if someone had removed all the bones from his body. This 12-year-old girl had not only been learning modern languages, but she had been independently studying topics that normally required postgraduate degrees to fully comprehend. 2 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I started when I was 10. My mother was working double shifts to pay for a private school for us, but then she lost that extra job. When I went back to public school, I had a lot of free time because the classes were easier. So I decided to use that time to learn things that really interested me. Each word was like a hammer blow directly to Julian's ego. He realized that while he had been boasting about the superior education his money could buy, this girl had been obtaining an education that was infinitely more impressive through sheer intellectual curiosity and determination. "Show me," Julian said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "If you really know all this, show me." Sophia looked at her mother, who nodded nervously, and she approached the desk where the mysterious document that had defeated the 5 most prestigious translators in the city lay. She picked up the papers with steady hands and studied them for a moment that felt like an eternity. Julian could see her eyes moving over the strange characters, recognizing patterns, making connections that the university specialists had missed. "It's interesting," Sophia murmured, more to herself than to the others. "It's not a single language. It's a combination of several writing systems organized in thematic layers." Julian felt as if the entire world was turning upside down. "What? What does that mean?" "The document is structured like a linguistic puzzle. Each paragraph is written in a different language, but all the paragraphs talk about the same theme from different cultural perspectives. It's as if someone wanted to preserve the same wisdom in multiple linguistic traditions." Elena approached slowly, fascinated despite her terror. She had never seen her daughter speak with such academic authority. She had never witnessed the true scope of her intelligence. "Can you read it?" Elena asked in a whisper. Sophia looked up from the document and directly at Julian. "Would you like me to try, Mr. Thorne?" Julian felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff. A part of him wanted to say no. He wanted to maintain the illusion that this girl was just that, a child who had gotten lucky with a few memorized phrases. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under decades of arrogance, was genuinely curious to know what this extraordinary creature would say. "Yes," he murmured. "Try." Sophia turned her attention back to the document and began to read, but what came out of her mouth made Julian freeze completely, because Sofia Ramirez, the 12-year-old daughter of a cleaner, began to read the first paragraph in perfect classical Mandarin. Her pronunciation was flawless, with tones that indicated not just knowledge of the language, but a deep understanding of its cultural nuances. The words flowed from her lips like ancient music, laden with meaning and authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. Julian was left with his mouth agape, his mocking expression transforming into one of absolute shock that he would never forget. For 48 years, he had operated under the belief that real education, true intelligence, was only available to those who could afford it. This girl had just completely shattered that belief. But Sophia didn't stop there. When she finished the first paragraph in Mandarin, without even pausing, she moved on to the second paragraph and began to read in classical Arabic with the same supernatural fluency. The words flowed from her mouth with a musicality that made Julian feel as if he were witnessing something impossible. This was not a girl reciting memorized phrases. This was a genuine scholar who understood not only the words, but the cultural and historical context behind each expression. Elena brought her hands to her heart, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her daughter, her little Sophia, who helped wash dishes after dinner and did her homework at the kitchen table under a dim light bulb, was demonstrating a level of knowledge that rivaled that of university professors. Sophia continued with the third paragraph, this time speaking in what sounded like ancient Italian. Julian had no idea what she was saying, but he could hear the reverence in her voice, as if she understood not only the words but the spiritual and philosophical weight they carried. With each language that Sophia mastered perfectly, Julian's humiliation grew exponentially. He realized that for decades he had been boasting about his superior education in front of employees like Elena, when in reality, Elena's daughter knew more about almost any academic subject than he ever would. His world of certainties was crumbling, word by word, language by language. Sophia read the fourth paragraph in what sounded like Russian, her voice taking on a different quality that indicated a deep respect for the tradition she was representing. Then the fifth paragraph in classical German, followed by the sixth in French. When she finally finished reading, Sophia looked up from the document and directly at Julian. For the first time in the history of his interactions with service employees, there was no submission in the eyes that looked at him. There was something he had never seen, directed at him. A deep, ancient, wise intelligence that had been hidden all this time behind economic poverty and youth. "Would you like me to translate the full meaning, Mr. Thorne?" Sophia asked with a calmness that contrasted dramatically with the trembling that had taken over everyone present. Julian tried to speak, but only a muffled sound came from his throat. His face had gone from red with anger to white with absolute shock. His hands were shaking, and he could feel cold sweat running down his back, despite the room's air conditioning. Elena approached her daughter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Sophia, how? Where did you learn all this?" Sophia smiled for the first time since this whole situation had begun, but it was a smile that held a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Mom," she replied, her voice suddenly filled with a dignity that Julian had never heard before in his office. "You always told me that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from me. So, I decided to get all the education I could find. It didn't matter if I had to get it from public libraries." Those words were like a dagger straight to Julian's heart. He realized that this girl had achieved more with free resources and personal determination than he had with millions of dollars and elite connections. Julian finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled and weak, a foreign sound in the cavernous, silent office. What does the document say?" Sophia placed the ancient papers on the marble desk with a reverent care, as if they were a precious treasure. Her movements were suddenly different. She no longer had the hunched posture of a girl trying to be invisible, but the straight-backed poise of someone who knew her own intellectual worth. "The document speaks of the true nature of wisdom and wealth," Sophia began, her voice clear and firm, each word landing with the weight of an ancient truth. "It says that true wisdom does not dwell in gilded palaces, but in humble hearts. That real wealth is not counted in coins, but in the ability to see the dignity in every soul." Each sentence was like an arrow aimed directly at Julian's soul. He realized that the document was not just a linguistic puzzle, it was a mirror, reflecting exactly what he had become and what he had lost in the process. "It says that he who believes himself superior because of his possessions is the poorest of all men, for he has lost the ability to recognize the light in others," Sophia continued, looking directly at Julian as she spoke. "What else?" Julian whispered, though a part of him no longer wanted to hear the answer. "That true power comes not from the ability to humiliate others, but from the ability to lift them up, and that when a powerful man discovers he has been blind to the wisdom that surrounded him, that is the moment of his true awakening, or his eternal damnation." The room fell into absolute silence when Sophia finished. Julian realized that he had not only been humiliated by a 12-year-old girl, he had been judged by her, and found wanting in every aspect that truly mattered. He had come face to face with his own soul, and he did not like what he saw. The silence that followed Sophia's words was so profound that Julian could hear his own heart beating, echoing like war drums in his ears. For the first time in his 48 years of life, he found himself completely speechless, defenseless, without the armor of arrogance he had carefully constructed over decades. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his marble desk, trying to find something solid in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. The girl standing before him was no longer just the daughter of a cleaning employee. She was a brutal mirror reflecting everything he had lost, everything he had never been, and everything he could never buy with his billions. Who are you, really?" Julian whispered, his voice barely audible in the room he had designed to intimidate, but which now felt like a prison of his own making. Sophia looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of compassion and a wisdom that seemed impossible in a 12-year-old. "I am exactly who you have always seen, Mr. Thorne. I am Sophia Ramirez, daughter of Elena Ramirez, a student at the local public school, and someone who believes that every person deserves to be treated with dignity." Each word was like a drop of acid on Julian's soul. He realized that for his entire life, he had been confusing external labels with a person's real worth. He had judged Elena by her cleaning uniform, without ever wondering what kind of mother could raise such an extraordinary daughter. He had assumed that economic poverty was equal to intellectual poverty, when the evidence to the contrary had been right in front of him for years. Elena approached her daughter and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Sophia, it's time for us to go," she murmured softly, clearly worried about the possible consequences of what had just happened. "No," Julian said suddenly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, don't go." Mother and daughter looked at him in surprise. For 6 years, Julian had never said please to Elena. He had never shown the slightest consideration for her schedule, her needs, or her basic humanity. I need to understand, Julian continued, struggling with words he had never uttered before. How is this possible? How can a 12-year-old girl know more than I do about everything? Sophia exchanged a look with her mother, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, and she approached the chair in front of Julian's desk. For the first time in the history of that room, someone who was not a millionaire sat as an equal before the owner of the empire. I don't know more than you about everything, Mr. Thorne, Sophia replied with brutal honesty. You know about business, about making money, about running companies. Those are skills I don't have. But, she continued, and Julian could feel the devastating blow coming, you never learned about the things that really matter. You never learned about respect, about humility, about seeing the humanity in others. And those are the most important lessons of all. Julian felt as if each word were a punch to the gut. And you did learn them? He asked, his voice lower than normal. My mother taught me, Sophia replied simply, looking at Elena with genuine love. She works 14 hours a day to give my brothers and me a decent life. She never complains, never speaks ill of the people who treat her unfairly. She always finds time to help me with my homework, even when she's exhausted. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard her daughter describe her sacrifices with such clarity and appreciation. Do you know what my mother taught me that is worth more than all your millions? Sophia asked, looking directly at Julian. Julian shook his head, unable to speak. She taught me that true wealth lies in the ability to make others feel valued. She taught me that intelligence without kindness is just educated cruelty. And she taught me that no matter how little you have materially, you can always choose to treat others with dignity. Each lesson was like a soft but devastating slap. Julian realized that Elena, whom he had treated as if she were invisible for 6 years, had been raising a philosopher in her humble home, while he had been accumulating expensive objects in his empty mansion. But I worked my whole life to get where I am, Julian protested weakly, clinging to the last shreds of his self-image. I built an empire from scratch. And that is admirable, Sophia agreed, surprising him with her frankness. But the question is, why did you build it? To help others? To make the world a better place? Or just to feel superior to people like my mother? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Julian opened his mouth to defend himself, but he realized he had no answer that wouldn't make him sound like the selfish monster he probably was. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice breaking with the most honest admission he had made in decades. That's the difference between us, Mr. Thorne, Sophia said softly. You never asked yourself why you were building your empire. I always ask myself why I'm learning each new language, reading each new book, studying each new subject. And what is your answer? Because I want to understand the world well enough to help change it. Because I believe that education is a tool for justice, not for arrogance. And because I want to honor the sacrifices my mother has made by giving a purpose to everything I've learned. Julian felt something strange moving in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It was a mixture of deep shame and something that might be admiration, respect. He wasn't sure, but he knew it was the first time in decades that he felt he was in the presence of someone genuinely superior to him. Not in money or power, but in the things that truly mattered. What do I do now? He asked, and he was surprised by the genuine vulnerability in his own voice. Sophia studied him for a long moment, as if assessing whether the question was sincere or just another manipulation. Apparently, she decided it was genuine. First, she said, you need to apologize to my mother, not just for today, but for 6 years of treating her as if she were invisible. Julian looked at Elena, who had been watching the entire conversation with a mixture of terror and fascination. For 6 years, she had simply been the cleaning lady to him. He had never known her full name, never asked about her family, never even acknowledged her basic humanity. Elena, he began, his voice trembling. I am sorry. I am sorry for all these years of treating you as if you weren't a real person. I am sorry for never asking about your life, for never recognizing that you have a family, dreams, hopes, and I am especially sorry for humiliating you in front of your daughter today. Elena gasped. In 6 years of work, Julian had never said her name, let alone apologized for anything. But an apology is not enough, Sophia continued relentlessly. Words are easy. Real change requires action. What kind of action? You need to change how you treat all your employees. You need to learn their names, understand their lives, recognize their humanity. You need to use your wealth to lift others up instead of humiliating them. But I don't know how to do that, Julian admitted, feeling like a lost child. Then learn, Sophia replied with the same determination she had used to learn 9 languages. My mother can teach you. She knows more about real leadership than all the business books you've read. Julian looked at Elena with new eyes. For the first time in 6 years, he truly saw her. He saw a woman who had raised an extraordinary daughter while working exhausting jobs. He saw someone who had maintained her dignity despite years of humiliation. He saw a real leader who had been under his nose all this time. Elena, he said softly, would you help me? Would you teach me how to be better? Elena looked at him for a long moment, assessing whether this transformation was genuine or temporary. Finally, she nodded slowly. But there are conditions, Sophia intervened. Whatever you want, Julian replied immediately. First, my mother needs a real job, with a decent salary and respect. No more cleaning toilets for a man who can afford 100 employees. Agreed. Second, you will create a scholarship program for children like me. Smart children from hardworking families who deserve real opportunities. Agreed. Third, you will learn at least 1 new language, so you can understand what it feels like to be in a student's shoes again. Julian blinked, surprised by this condition. Which language? Sophia smiled for the first time since this whole situation had begun. I will teach you Mandarin, on Tuesdays after work, at the public library. The idea of Julian Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in New York, learning a language at a public library was so revolutionary it almost seemed impossible. But as he looked at this extraordinary girl and her resilient mother, he realized that maybe it was exactly the kind of impossible he needed in his life. Do we have a deal? Sophia asked, extending her small but firm hand. Julian looked at the girl's hand for a moment, knowing that shaking it would fundamentally change who he was as a person. Then, for the first time in decades, he made a decision based not on money or power, but on the hope of becoming someone worthy of respect. He shook Sophia's hand firmly. We have a deal, he said, and for the first time in years, I feel like I've done something truly important. The change had begun. The man who had entered that room as an arrogant tyrant was leaving as someone willing to learn, and all because a 12-year-old girl had the courage to show a powerful man that he had been measuring success with all the wrong metrics. That true wealth is not accumulated, but shared. That true intelligence is not imposed, but offered. And that true leadership does not dominate, but serves. 3 days after the encounter that had shattered his world, Julian Thorne found himself doing something he had never imagined in his entire life, waiting nervously in the lobby of the New York Public Library, a building he had passed for decades without ever noticing. His hands were sweating as he clutched a basic university notebook he had bought at a neighborhood stationery store. He felt like a first-day student, waiting to meet his most intimidating professor. The contrast could not have been more dramatic. For 48 years, Julian had operated from glass towers, marble offices, and boardrooms where every object cost more than the annual salary of an average family. Now he was standing in a public space, surrounded by children doing their homework, elderly people reading newspapers, and mothers carrying babies while searching for books. It was a world completely different from his, a world that had existed in parallel to his bubble of privilege, without him ever perceiving it. Mr. Thorne, a familiar voice pulled him from his anxious reflections. He turned to see Sophia walking towards him, a school backpack full of books slung over her shoulder and a smile that was both professional and warm. She was no longer wearing the worn-out school uniform from their first encounter, but casual weekend clothes that, while clearly not expensive, were neat and carefully coordinated. Sophia, Julian replied, surprised at how natural it felt to say her name with genuine respect. Thank you for doing this. Are you ready for your first lesson? Sophia asked, gesturing towards the study tables that were filled with students of all ages. Honestly, I'm terrified, Julian admitted, a confession that would have been unthinkable a week ago. I haven't been a student since college, and that was 30 years ago. Sophia led him to the language section, an area Julian never knew existed. The walls were covered with posters of alphabets in different languages, world maps marking linguistic families, and schedules for free classes in dozens of languages. Is all of this free? Julian asked with genuine disbelief. Completely free, Sophia replied as she arranged basic Mandarin materials on the table. The city believes that education should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford it. The statement hit Julian like a gentle slap. For decades, he had assumed that quality education was a privilege that was bought, when apparently it had been available just a few blocks from his office all this time. Let's start with the basics, Sophia announced, opening a worn but well-cared-for textbook. The 4 tones of Mandarin are fundamental. Without them, a word can mean completely different things. For the next hour, Julian experienced something he hadn't felt in decades: the absolute humility of being completely ignorant on a subject. Sophia was a patient but demanding teacher, correcting his pronunciation with the same academic authority she had shown when translating the mysterious document. Ma, 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 ma. Julian tried to repeat the tones, his voice sounding clumsy and harsh compared to Sophia's musical fluency. Better, Sophia encouraged him after his 10th attempt. Remember, the first tone is high and flat, as if you're singing a sustained note. Julian realized he was sweating from the mental effort of something this 12-year-old girl mastered with apparent ease. It was a lesson in humility more profound than any financial loss he had ever experienced. "Can I ask you something?" Julian said during a break. "Of course. How can you teach someone who treated you so badly with such patience?" Sophia considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I believe in second chances, and because teaching is a way of honoring all the teachers who were patient with me." "But you're not angry? You don't feel resentment?" "I was angry," Sophia admitted honestly. "Very angry. But my mother taught me that anger is like holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. In the end, you're the one who gets burned." The wisdom of those words, coming from someone who could be his granddaughter, struck Julian deeply. He realized he had been holding on to hot coals of arrogance and contempt for decades, burning himself without even realizing it. "Let's continue," he said, determined to honor his young teacher's patience with genuine effort. As he clumsily progressed through basic Mandarin characters, Julian became aware of his surroundings. At the next table, an elderly woman was helping a child with math. At another, a group of teenagers was studying quietly for exams. In the computer section, adults were learning basic digital skills. It was a microcosm of learning and growth that had existed in parallel to his world of luxury, without him ever noticing. He realized he had been living in a bubble so dense that he had completely lost sight of the humanity that surrounded him. "Sophia," he said softly, "can I meet some of your other teachers?" Sophia's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd like that?" "I'd love to." Sophia led him through the library, introducing him to an extraordinary community of volunteer educators that had been operating under his nose for years. He met Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who taught Arabic while working as a taxi driver. Mrs. Wang, a retiree who had been a professor in Beijing before immigrating to be with her family. Maria, a domestic worker who taught Italian on weekends. Each introduction was like a gentle blow to his previous worldview. These people, whom he would have automatically dismissed for their service jobs, turned out to be brilliant educators with extraordinary stories of resilience and knowledge. "Dr. Ahmed," Julian said, using the title Sophia told him was appropriate. "Sophia tells me you teach classical Arabic." Ahmed smiled warmly. "It is an honor to keep the language alive. In my country, I was a university professor of literature. Here, I drive a taxi. But the languages live in the heart." Julian felt a pang of shame as he remembered how many times he had taken taxis driven by men like Ahmed, without ever wondering about their previous lives, their losses, their silent contributions to the community. Could you teach me a little Arabic too?" he asked timidly. "It would be an honor," Ahmed replied, and Julian could see tears forming in his eyes. "It has been a long time since someone asked me to teach for the simple love of knowledge." When he finally finished his first Mandarin lesson, Julian felt physically and mentally exhausted, but also strangely energized. For decades, he had assumed he was done learning, that his education was complete. Discovering that he could still struggle with new concepts, still feel the satisfaction of mastering something difficult, was an unexpected revelation. "Same time next week?" Sophia asked as she packed up her materials. "Absolutely," Julian replied without hesitation. "And Sophia, thank you. Not just for the language lesson, but for showing me a world I was ignoring." "You weren't ignoring it," Sophia corrected gently. "You just didn't know it existed. Now that you do, You can choose what to do with that knowledge. As Julian drove back to his mansion that night, his thoughts were completely occupied by the day's lessons. Not just the Mandarin lessons, but the deeper lessons about community, humility, and the wealth of knowledge that existed in places he had never thought to look. The next day, Julian did something that surprised his entire executive team. He called an emergency meeting, not to discuss profits or expansion, but to talk about corporate social responsibility. "I want us to establish a full scholarship program for students from working-class families," he announced to his surprised executives. "And I want us to sponsor language programs in public libraries across the city." "What's the return on investment?" his CFO asked with evident confusion. "The return is that we live in a better society," Julian replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "The return is that we stop wasting human talent by accident of birth." His executives exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking their boss had lost his mind. But Julian no longer cared what the men who had been complicit in his previous arrogance thought. That same week, he fulfilled another of his promises. Elena Ramirez was officially hired as the Director of Human Development, with a salary that was 10 times what she had been earning as a cleaning employee. Her first task would be to work with Julian to identify and develop hidden talent among all the company's employees. "Elena," Julian said to her during their first official meeting, "I want you to teach me everything Sophia says you know about real leadership." Elena, still adjusting to her new office and new status, looked at him with a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Mr. Thorne, real leadership isn't about having power over others. It's about having the power to lift others up. Teach me," Julian said simply. And so began an education that was worth more than all the university degrees and business master's degrees that money could buy. An education about humanity, humility, and the responsibility that comes with real privilege. For the first time in decades, Julian Thorne was learning the lessons that truly mattered, and discovering that real growth came not from accumulating more, but from becoming more. Not from having more power, but from using the power one has to elevate others. 6 weeks after the encounter that had changed everything, Julian Thorne found himself facing something he hadn't anticipated. A quiet but determined rebellion from his closest social circle. The exclusive business club where he had lunched every Friday for the past 15 years had suddenly become hostile territory. "Julian, we need to talk," declared Fernando Carvalho, an oil tycoon and one of his oldest golf partners, as he sat down heavily in front of him in the club's private dining room. His eyes had the hardness of someone who had come to stage an intervention. "Of course, Fernando. What do you want to talk about?" Julian replied, though he could perfectly guess where the conversation was headed. "About your recent, strange behavior," Fernando began, gesturing with his $2,000 glass of wine. "The whole city is talking. They say you're learning languages in public libraries, that you've promoted a cleaner to an executive position, that you're spending millions on scholarships for poor children. All of that is true," Julian confirmed calmly, continuing with his lunch as if they were discussing the weather. "Have you gone mad?" interjected Sebastian Torres, the heir to a pharmaceutical empire, his voice laced with disbelief. "A cleaner as an executive? You, learning in public libraries with common people?" Julian felt a familiar pang of irritation, but this time it wasn't directed at those who challenged him, but at his own past attitudes reflected in his old friends. "Elena Ramirez is smarter and has better leadership skills than most of the executives I've met," Julian replied calmly. "And yes, I am learning Mandarin and Arabic from extraordinary teachers who happen to work as taxi drivers and domestic workers." "Extraordinary teachers who work as taxi drivers?" Fernando laughed cruelly. "Julian, you're completely losing touch with reality. Those people aren't real teachers. They're failures who couldn't keep jobs in their own countries." The statement hit Julian like a slap. It was exactly the kind of comment he himself would have made 6 weeks ago. And now, it seemed not only ignorant, but cruelly inhuman. "Fernando, Dr. Ahmed held a chair in Arabic literature at the University of Damascus before the war destroyed his country," Julian replied, his voice taking on a tone his friends had rarely heard. "Mrs. Wang was the head of the linguistics department in Beijing before she immigrated to reunite with her family. They are not failures. They are brilliant refugees and immigrants who are rebuilding their lives." "And since when do you care about that?" Sebastian asked with evident contempt. "For years you've mocked these same people. What changed?" Julian considered the question carefully. What had really changed? Was it just the shock of being humiliated by Sophia? Or had it been something deeper? I realized I was living in a bubble so dense that I had completely lost sight of what it means to be human. Julian answered honestly. I realized I had confused financial success with moral superiority, and that I was wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices. That's ridiculous, interrupted Ricardo Vasconcelos, a telecommunications magnate who had arrived late to the conversation but had heard enough to catch up. Julian, we all know you're going through some kind of crisis. Maybe you should consider taking a vacation, seeing a psychiatrist. I'm not having a crisis, Julian interrupted firmly. For the first time in decades, I am completely sane. You are the ones living in a fantasy where money makes you better people. The silence that followed was tense and hostile. Julian could see that he had crossed a line with his old friends, who had come expecting him to admit his mistake and return to the fold of shared arrogance. Look, Julian. Fernando leaned forward, his voice becoming threatening. I don't know what game you're playing, but it's affecting all of us. The other businessmen are starting to question our circle. They're wondering if we've all gone soft. And that worries you? Julian asked with genuine curiosity. Of course it worries me. Our power comes from staying united, from presenting a unified front. When one of us starts acting like a social activist, it weakens everyone. Julian realized something fundamental at that moment. His old friends weren't worried about his mental well-being or his business success. They were worried because his transformation threatened the system of privilege from which they all benefited. Do you know what I've learned in these 6 weeks? Julian asked, standing up slowly. I've learned that true power doesn't come from the ability to exclude others, but from the ability to lift them up. That's progressive nonsense, Sebastian spat. Real power comes from competition, from superiority, from keeping the competition down. And how is that working out for you? Julian asked. Are you happy? Do you feel fulfilled? Can you look at yourselves in the mirror and feel proud of who you are as people? The questions hung in the air like bombs waiting to explode. Julian could see in the faces of his old friends that he had touched on something uncomfortable, something they preferred not to examine. Happiness is a luxury, Ricardo replied defensively. We focus on real success. And what is real success? Julian pressed. Numbers in a bank account, the ability to humiliate employees, living in a bubble where you never have to confront your own humanity. You're talking like an idiot. Fernando stood up abruptly, clearly frustrated. Julian, we're going to give you a week to reconsider this phase. After that, you'll have to choose between keeping your place in this circle or continuing with this social justice nonsense. I don't need a week, Julian replied immediately. I choose to continue being a decent person. If that means losing your approval, then so be it. The silence that followed was absolute. For 15 years, these men had been his closest social circle, his validators, his accomplices in mutual arrogance. Losing their approval would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. Fine, Fernando said finally, picking up his jacket. But when this experiment in kindness fails, when you realize that the real world doesn't work with hugs and language classes, don't come to us asking to be let back in. I won't, Julian promised, because I've discovered something you apparently have never experienced. I found a social circle based on mutual respect, personal growth, and genuine contribution to the well-being of others. And it turns out it's infinitely more satisfying than this. As his old friends left the room with expressions of disgust, Julian felt strangely relieved. For years he had maintained these friendships out of habit and social convenience, without realizing how toxic they had been to his development as a person. That same afternoon, Julian attended his weekly session at the public library. As he practiced Chinese characters with Sophia, he told her about his confrontation with his old friends. Do you feel bad about losing those friendships? Sophia asked with genuine curiosity. Surprisingly, no, Julian admitted. I feel like I've dropped a weight I've been carrying for years without realizing it. It's normal, commented Ahmed, who had joined their study session. When we start to grow as people, sometimes we have to leave behind relationships that no longer serve us. But don't you feel lonely sometimes? Julian asked. Yes, Mrs. Wang interjected from the next table. But then we discover that there's a whole world of authentic people waiting to meet us. It's just that before, we couldn't see them, because we were surrounded by mirrors that reflected our worst version. The words resonated deeply with Julian. He realized he had been surrounded by people who reflected and validated his worst qualities, while now he was surrounded by people who inspired him to be better. Besides, Sophia added with a smile, now you have real friends. Friends who value you for who you're trying to be, not for how much money you have. Julian looked around the study table. Sophia with her impossible wisdom, Ahmed with his unshakable dignity, Mrs. Wang with her infinite patience. And he realized she was right. He had gained something much more valuable than what he had lost. You're right, he said finally. And you know what the best part of all this is? What? They asked in unison. For the first time in decades, when I look in the mirror, I like the person I see looking back. It was the simplest and most profound truth he had uttered in his entire life. The transformation was really happening, cell by cell, thought by thought, action by action. And although he had lost the respect of his old social circle, he had gained something infinitely more precious, self-respect. That night, as he drove home, Julian reflected on the extraordinary path he had traveled. He had started as an arrogant tyrant, convinced of his superiority, and was transforming into someone who finally understood that true greatness doesn't come from being above others, but from being alongside them. The most important lesson had not come from business books or expensive consultants, but from a 12-year-old girl who had the courage to show a powerful man that he had been measuring success with all the wrong metrics. That true wealth is not accumulated, but shared. That true intelligence is not imposed, but offered. And that true leadership does not dominate, but serves. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundations had been laid. And for the first time in his adult life, Julian Thorne felt he was on the right path. A year after the encounter that had changed everything, Julian Thorne found himself standing in the same place where his transformation had begun, the 87th floor room of his corporate tower. But it was no longer the same room, just as he was no longer the same man. The black marble walls had been replaced with expansive windows that filled the space with natural light. The expensive art pieces had given way to photographs of the beneficiaries of his educational programs. And where there was once an intimidating marble desk, there was now a round wooden table where he met weekly with Elena, Sophia, and other community leaders to plan new initiatives. This morning was special. He had called a press conference to announce something that would have been unthinkable a year ago: the creation of the Sofia Ramirez Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $500 million, almost half of his personal fortune, dedicated to expanding educational programs throughout the country. Mr. Thorne, Elena's professional voice pulled him from his reflections as she reviewed the final documents for the foundation. The journalists have arrived. The representatives from the 20 universities that have committed to participating in the national program are also here. Elena Ramirez had transformed as much as Julian had over these months. She no longer wore the navy blue cleaning uniform, but elegant professional suits that reflected her new position as the foundation's executive director. But more than her external appearance, what had changed was her posture. She no longer walked with her head bowed, expecting to be invisible, but with the confidence of someone who knows her ideas are valued and respected. And Sophia? Julian asked, though he knew she would never miss such an important event. She's in the auditorium, reviewing her presentation. She's been working on it for weeks. Elena smiled. I think she's going to surprise everyone. As they walked to the auditorium, Julian reflected on the extraordinary year that had passed. The changes had not only been in his personal life, but in the entire structure of his company and its impact on the community. Thorne Technologies had been recognized as the most innovative company in corporate social responsibility in the country. Employee turnover had dropped to virtually zero. Productivity had increased by 45%. And more importantly, it had become the most desired employer in the country, not for its high salaries, but for the culture of respect and personal growth it had cultivated. Mr. Thorne, a familiar voice stopped him in the hallway. It was Maria Helena Rodriguez, the first scholarship recipient to graduate from the program, who now worked as an engineer in his company while finishing a master's degree in public administration. Maria Helena, what a joy to see you here. Julian greeted her with genuine affection. How are your studies going? Incredibly well, thank you, sir. But I wanted to tell you something before the conference. Maria Helena paused, clearly emotional. Yesterday, I received a letter from my younger sister. She's a freshman in high school, and she wrote to tell me that she wants to be like you when she grows up. Julian felt a lump in his throat. Like me? Yes. She says she wants to be someone who uses their success to help others succeed. She also says that you taught her that the truly rich are those who enrich others. The profound simplicity of those words, filtered through the perspective of a teenager, hit Julian harder than any corporate recognition he had ever received. He realized that the true indicator of his transformation was not the newspaper articles or the awards, but the kind of example he was setting for the next generation. When they entered the auditorium, Julian was breathless at what he saw. It wasn't just the presence of national and international journalists, nor the university representatives from all over the country. It was the quality of the audience. Hundreds of students from educational programs, parents from working-class families, volunteer teachers from the libraries, employees from his company, refugees and immigrants who had found new opportunities, and community leaders who had emerged from the movement that had started with a simple lesson in humility. Dr. Ahmed, Julian greeted the Syrian refugee, who now directed language programs in 18 libraries in the city. How does it feel to see all this? It feels like witnessing the birth of something that will change the world, Ahmed replied with tears in his eyes. A year ago, I was a taxi driver with broken dreams. Today, I am the coordinator of a program that has taught languages to more than 2,000 people. This is what a real second chance means. And you, sir, have given second chances to thousands of people, including himself, interjected Mrs. Wang, who had developed a Mandarin curriculum that was now being used in universities in 4 states. Julian realized the profound truth in those words. His transformation had essentially been a second chance to be the person he had always had the potential to be, but who had been buried under decades of arrogance and emotional disconnection. Finally, the moment of the official conference arrived. Julian went to the podium, but before he began, he did something that surprised everyone. He invited Sophia to join him on stage. Sophia Ramirez, now 13, had grown not only physically, but in presence and moral authority. She wore an elegant navy blue dress, not expensive, but chosen with the same care that characterized everything she did. Her eyes had the same penetrating intelligence that had disconcerted Julian a year ago, but now they also had the confidence of someone who had seen her ideas turn into tangible reality. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began, his voice clear but laden with genuine emotion. Exactly 1 year ago, I stood in this very room, convinced that I was one of the most successful men in America. I had billions of dollars, the fear-based respect of my employees, and the envious admiration of my peers. I was also, without knowing it, one of the poorest and most miserable men in the country. The auditorium was in absolute silence, each word resonating with the authority of lived experience. Then, this extraordinary young woman walked into my office and taught me the most important lesson of my life. Sophia Ramirez taught me that I had been confusing financial success with human superiority, that I had been wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices, and that I had been using my privilege to separate instead of connect, to humiliate instead of elevate. Julian looked at Sophia, who smiled at him encouragingly. But Sophia didn't just humiliate me, though I certainly deserved it. She offered me something much more valuable. She offered me the opportunity for redemption. She taught me that it's never too late to change, that it's never too late to be better, and that real transformation requires not only recognizing your mistakes, but taking concrete actions to amend them. Over this year, I have had the privilege of learning from an extraordinary community of educators, students, working-class families, refugees, and immigrants who have shown me what it truly means to contribute to society. I have learned that education is the great equalizer. The talent is evenly distributed, but opportunities are not, and that when we invest in human potential, the returns surpass any financial investment. Julian paused, allowing the words to resonate in the packed auditorium. Today I announce the creation of the Sophia Ramirez Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $500 million, dedicated to expanding inclusive educational programs throughout the country. But more important than the money is the philosophy behind this foundation. The belief that every person, no matter where they were born or how much money their parents have, deserves the opportunity to reach their full potential. The ovation that followed was immediate and sustained, but Julian raised a hand to continue. However, I don't want this conference to be about me or my money. I want it to be about the people who truly made this transformation possible. I want you to listen to Sophia Ramirez, who at 13 understands more about leadership, human dignity, and social justice than most adults I know. Julian stepped away from the microphone and gestured to Sophia, who approached with the same quiet confidence she had shown during their first encounter. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Sophia began, her voice clear and firm, resonating throughout the auditorium. "A year ago, when I first walked into your office, I wasn't trying to change the world. I was just trying to defend my mother's dignity and demonstrate that a person's worth is not determined by their job or their bank account. But what I've learned over this year is that individual changes can create waves that transform entire communities. When one person decides to see the humanity in others, when they decide to use their privilege to create opportunities instead of barriers, when they decide that real success is measured by how much we lift others up, that individual decision can change thousands of lives." Sophia looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students, parents, teachers. "The programs we are announcing today are not just about education. They are about dignity. They are about the fundamental belief that every child, every young person, every adult deserves the opportunity to reach their potential. They are about creating a society where your zip code doesn't determine your destiny, where your parents' job doesn't limit your dreams, where curiosity and effort are rewarded no matter your background." When Sophia finished her presentation, the ovation was unlike anything Julian had ever heard. It wasn't just applause, it was the sound of collective hope, of the recognition that real change was possible, of the understanding that they were witnessing the birth of something transformative. After the conference, as the crowd dispersed, Julian found himself alone with Sophia and Elena in the transformed room. "How do you feel, Julian?" Elena asked, gesturing to the windows that now showed a city where hundreds of young people had new opportunities thanks to the programs they had created. "I feel like I've finally found what my life was made for," Julian answered honestly. "Not to accumulate personal wealth, but to distribute opportunities. Not to demonstrate superiority, but to recognize and nurture the greatness in others." "And you don't miss your old life?" Sophia asked with genuine curiosity. "Do you know what I miss about my old life?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," Julian replied, "because I realize now that that old life wasn't really living. It was simply existing in a bubble of privilege that separated me from everything that makes life worth living. Real human connections, a transcendent purpose, the satisfaction of contributing to the well-being of others. Besides," he added with a smile, "it turns out that helping others is the most selfishly satisfying activity there is. Every time I see a student graduate, every time I see a family break cycles of educational poverty, every time I see a refugee find new hope, I experience a joy that no financial transaction had ever given me." As the sun set over the city, the three of them stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the extraordinary year they had shared and the years of impact that were to come. "Do you know what the most incredible thing about all this is?" Julian finally broke the silence. "What?" asked Sophia and Elena in unison. "That this is just the beginning. The $500 million from the foundation will directly touch the lives of at least 50,000 students in the next 5 years. But those students will touch the lives of others, who will touch the lives of others. The impact will multiply exponentially for decades. It's like throwing a stone into a lake," Sophia observed. "The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has disappeared." "Exactly. And the original stone was a 12-year-old girl who had the courage to confront a powerful man with the truth," Julian replied. "Sophia, you didn't just change my life. You changed the course of thousands of lives you don't even know yet." As they left the room that night, Julian knew he had found something that all his previous money could never buy. A legacy that would endure long beyond his own life. A contribution to the world that would be measured not in financial gains, but in opportunities created, in dreams realized, in cycles of injustice broken. The transformation was complete, but the impact was just beginning. And it had all started with a simple lesson about human dignity, taught by an extraordinary girl who had seen beyond appearances to recognize the potential for goodness that exists in every human heart.